Okay, everyone, and good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're at today. My name is Carl Wright. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer at AttackIQ. And today I'm welcoming you to our webinar, DORA Demystified, Essential Strategies for Success. I'm joined by our two panelists today, and I'll let them make introductions to themselves. Michael, why don't we start with you?
All right, thanks so much, Carl. So I'm Michael Egan. I'm a partner at Cooley LLP, law firm in our cyber data privacy group. I'm based in DC. My focus area is cybersecurity and privacy compliance and incident response for large global companies, public companies, particularly in the financial and fintech spaces. And I also sit on a small FBI advisory committee that advises the FBI cybersecurity division on incident response for private and public companies globally. Bart?
Hi there, my name is Bart Regenhardt. I'm a German qualified lawyer. I work with Michael. I'm the European dependent of the side of the cyber security team we have at Cooley. I worked at a German bank before I joined Cooley, so I'm quite familiar with the topic of DORA, all those obligations that have been in existence, and we are advising various financial institutions, but also service provider, getting compliant and understanding, demystifying DORA.
Well, Mike and Bart, thank you so much for joining today. I think this is going to be a great discussion. Obviously, DORA's been, people have been thinking about it now for 2 years, at least at a minimum. Practitioners, certainly for the last year, have been trying to figure out exactly, what they need to do first, second, third, and, keep doing as a journey that DORA is. So I think for today, what we'll do is I think we have a great presentation. And then we'll, excuse me, we have some questions as well. For our audience that's out there, up in the right-hand corner, there's a chat tool. So if you do have questions during the session, I'll be monitoring that. So if you have some questions, just put them in there. And when I find a great time for breaking the action, I'll ask Mike and Bart those questions. So with that said, Bart, why don't we get started?
Sure, thanks. So we're going to give you a broad overview of what DORA is and essentially focus on 4 areas. First, giving you an overview of the general impact and scope of DORA. Second, going into some of the details of who might be impacted. Also, what the general structure of DORA is. Third, looking at what DORA specifically means for technology providers. And fourth, giving you some key checklists to address DORA, respectively, if you are with a financial service entity or whether you are a technology provider. Jumping in, the general impact of DORA and the scope of DORA. DORA is intended as digital operational resilience for EU financial entities. So the scope is slightly changing from what you might have seen or what you would expect with all the other laws currently operational in Europe. We have GDPR, we have the NIS2 directive, we have the Cyber Resilience Act. All those laws complement each other, and DORA is specifically for the financial sector addressing cybersecurity challenges. It's intended to create a uniform umbrella for all financial entities, making sure that their cybersecurity posture is bolstered and that they have the right policies, procedures in place to react in case of cybersecurity incidents, and then address these and mitigate in advance any threats that might come from cybersecurity challenges. This framework is not just focused on financial entities, but also the risk management surrounding their vendors. This is one key pillar of the new DORA obligations we will see. and some of you might have experienced or will experience in the next few months and weeks. One of the key changes is that DORA makes cybersecurity for financial entities a boardroom responsibility. So we'll see that it's not just the cybersecurity team, the IT teams within financial entities trying to raise their hand and their flag that cybersecurity is important, but DORA helps them now making sure that the board addresses cybersecurity and provides also the relevant resources. DORA came into effect just last week. So far, we have not seen any fines. We have not seen immediate investigations, but you can be certain that this will happen quite soon. Moving on to the scope, financial entities. As said, this is what DORA focuses on. There are about 21 entities identified under DORA, which are directly in scope and of DORA and under the scrutiny of the relevant supervisory authorities. But it's not just the financial entities which are addressed, but it's also ICT third-party service providers, so technology providers. All service providers, vendors assisting or providing information communication technology services to financial entities. This can be cloud services, any software as a service. All those service providers are now indirectly or even directly in scope and addressed and need to comply with certain obligations under DORA. We can split those into three categories. We have tier one, where it's just a normal ICT service provider, which has to comply with the least rigid obligations. We have ICT third-party service providers, which are supporting critical or important functions. They have to comply with heightened security and contractual obligations when they provide their services to financial entities which are subject to DORA. The decision whether you are supporting critical or important function lies primarily with the financial entity. What we're seeing right now, a lot of financial entities reaching out to service providers and telling them, we consider you to be a critical or important, supporting some of our critical or important functions. And then there is a struggle sometimes to try to push back on those assessments and try to get service providers in tier one to make sure those vendors need to comply with less obligations. And then we have tier three, critical ICT third-party service providers. Those ones are designated by the supervisory authorities in Europe. This will happen in the coming weeks. At least that's what is expected. There was a big open discussion on this in December last year, where there was kind of a consultation, and those ones who are critical ICT third-party service providers, they will also become directly subject to DORA. So whereas tier one and tier two are not directly under the supervision of the banking authorities, tier three ICT service providers will become subject to the supervision of the financial and the authorities of the financial services.
So Bart, we've got a couple good questions here. I'm going to go ahead and sneak in since it's timely with this slide. What about data aggregators?
Well, they provide an ICT service, so they are will be considered an ICT third-party service provider. And then it's the question for the bank how critical this data aggregation is to the financial entity to which they provide their services, unlikely that the data aggregator will be tier 3. So it's a question whether it's tier 1 or tier 2 for those services.
Great. We have one more great question, which is, what is exactly the difference between a tier 1 normal ICT third-party service?
Well, normal is just to get the terminology right. There are ICT third-party service providers. That's the general term, and then it starts to pull you into the tier 2 category. So the normal is just to make sure that there is a tier 1 and understanding that it's actually 3 categories, because this is not really clear. If you read DORA, you will see that there are some uncertainties.
Wait a second, a regulation that's not clear? I don't believe that.
Well, it's a European one. What do you expect?
We have another great question. What happens with a tier 3 service provider located outside the EU?
Well, location in that respect does not make a difference. So DORA applies to financial entities within the European Union, and then all their third-party service providers, regardless of where they are located, are affected, and financial entities need to engage and make sure that they have contractual provisions in place with those third-party service providers, and also the designation by the authorities is not affected just because you're located outside of Europe.
Well, I have my own personal follow-up question. So if I'm a third-party provider outside of Europe, in let's say North America, how are you going to, do they find the financial institution, or they try to find the provider?
Tier 1, tier 2, it's going to be the financial institution. That's why they are right now racing and trying to, so European financial institutions are trying to go through all their service providers, do a risk assessment, consider those which are tier 2, probably target those first and try to get contractual obligations in place with those, and then go to tier 1. And for tier 3, you will be sure, you will be asserted that you are one, because you will get a mail from a European authority telling you they have designated you as a critical ICT third-party service provider.
And Carl, this isn't the first time we've seen this too out of Europe. I mean, extraterritorial application of these laws is now becoming increasingly prevalent. And so we see this a lot on the US end, where companies have no physical presence, no assets in Europe, but are subject to European privacy laws, security laws, be it GDPR, NIS2, whatever it might be. So, and this sort of, I think the one thing, and Bart touched on this a moment ago, but it's just the expansion and scope of what's considered sort of a financial institution. It's really important that companies look at, okay, for a service provider, who are our customers here? Because things that you might not think of as traditional, financial institutions, it's not just banks, right? It goes well beyond that. And that's the continuation of a trend we've seen here in the United States, with them expanding out this concept of a financial institution to capture, auto lenders, car dealerships, travel agencies in some cases, right? All of these things, this concept is growing and growing, and the extraterritorial application that Bart was just describing makes it pretty challenging to analyze and understand where you've got that direct applicability, even if you've got no presence in Europe.
Well, I think this is going to be a slog fest. So you just somebody else asked another question, which I think fits right into what you're talking about there, Mike. Their question is: let's say a bank aggregates account information from other banks on behalf of their clients. If this individual is a provider of that information through an FTX API, do I need to do due diligence to the bank requesting the information on behalf of their clients? So, I mean, this is a slippery slope.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the challenge, is understanding sort of, okay, for each of these roles, right? If we're a bank, then we're going to be a financial institution under the rules, right? If we're located in Europe, we're going to be directly subject to DORA. If we're just providing that back end service through an API, or just doing the data aggregation, do we count as a data reporting service provider? which is also directly subject as a financial institution under DORA? Or is it just a back-end services, in which case, which of these three tiers of service providers do we qualify as? If we're a U.S. bank, no presence in Europe, but we're providing services to European banks on the back end, that's where we might get pulled in sort of in a secondary manner through this mechanism.
I think predictably this is going to be the hot part of this conversation today. So we're going to do one more question on here because I think it's a great question, and obviously it actually impacts my business as well. So this question is around, someone is a SaaS software provider out of the U.S. and a bank is basically, or financial service organization in the EU is our customer. And now, does it depend on whether or not, that product is identified as critical to, some functions, or are you automatically brought into this?
Art, you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. So if it's a SaaS service provided outside of Europe to European financial entities, then you can expect that the financial entity from Europe will reach out and ask you to sign and agree on contractual terms that comply with DORA. They can assess and determine whether you are tier 1, normal, or tier 2. You'll not end up in tier 3. That's the assessment to be done by the authorities. There in tier 3, we expect that this will be data storage, cloud computing services such as AWS, Azure. So critical ICT service providers, which in case they collapse, the entire banking system will have critical risks, because so many financial institutions rely on those service providers. So tier 3 is one of the smaller type of companies where you could be covered in. You should be concerned about tier 1 and tier 2, and always should try to push for tier 1, because the obligations under tier 2 are already quite onerous when you need to comply with those.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And not surprisingly, we have more questions on this topic, but I hate to tell this to the audience. We actually have some other areas that are even worse to understand than this that we'd like to demystify. So all the questions that are coming in, Bart and Mike will answer. So we will take these offline and compose them, and then Liz will send out a FAQ post this particular webinar with questions to the answers that we didn't get to. But we're definitely going to take some more questions from the audience as we get into some of these even more complex constructs of the regulation. So let's go on to the next slide, please.
Sure. So what we will now look at is basically compliance obligations from the perspective of the financial entity. You can see here basically the 4 pillars DORA requires financial entities to comply with. ICT risk management, which requires implementing and executing policies and procedure. Second pillar, incident management. Their financial entities will be prompted to have their risk procedures, their incident response plans updated and aligned with DORA requirements. Then digital operational resilience testing. All financial entities are prompted and are required to perform testing, and a few of them are even required to perform threat-led penetration testing. And in a 4th pillar, this is what we touched on just now, ICT third-party risk management. Basically, financial institutions need to do the assessment, are you a tier 1, are you a tier 2, and then approach you and ask you to execute contractual obligations, which we'll touch on just in a minute. We're now zooming in on the incident management, the reporting requirements that financial institutions need to comply with. you might be familiar with those under GDPR. There, the magical timeline was always 27 hours. This now substantially shifts and gets shorter for financial entities, where they have to provide initial reporting to authorities already within 4 hours. That's going to be really challenging. And it's not just the financial entity. They are reliant on all their vendors. So you will see, or we expect that this will become critical, that they will ask you to also report any incident that might have severe impact on the financial entity with way shorter timelines. What you see is it's not just DORA, GDPR, but we have also in Europe NIS2, which is the umbrella agreement. DORA being sector specific to financial institutions, NIS2 applying across the board to all critical infrastructure in Europe. So there, if you are also active in the medical sector, or if you're active in the telco sector, those timelines will shift as well.
One thing to just bear in mind here is, and this we can't, with the advent of GDPR, the 72-hour rule really threw things into the mix. I think, what we're seeing is globally a progressive reduction in the amount of time you have to make a decision around whether we have to report, and understanding the implications of that. And, this becomes incredibly challenging. We already see this in the DoD, the defense context in the United States, right? You have to report, depending on sort of how critical you are, maybe within 24 hours, sometimes within an hour, right? If you're a supercritical system in the defense space. But having this be a broad-based reporting mechanism within 4 hours, it's incredibly hard to meet that from an incident response standpoint, right? You don't know anything after 4 hours, let alone classifications or things like that. So really being able to meet this standard, have it documented well, is something that's going to take an immense amount of preparation and business buy-in to understand the fact that if you're reporting it to European authorities, you have to assume you're then reporting it to the world, because no domestic authority in the United States wants to be left behind on that, right? So understanding that, once you ring that bell, you can't really unring it. So having those good policies and procedures in place to understand that this isn't just, while the requirement is just to notify in Europe, you really have to be thinking about this if you provide services or you are a financial institution globally, that notification is really going to start echoing around the world pretty quickly.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. So I guess speed and timeliness and accuracy is always a problem. So what happens if your initial assessment of, in this report isn't as accurate as it would have been if you would have taken 8 hours to write it? Are you penalized for, accuracy?
Well, in the near future, I think financial institutions as well as authorities need to adapt and find a way to communicate with each other. There are templates for the early warning, so those have been published, and it's in the end a Q&A. You have a question you need to answer, and this is what you're supposed to do within the first 4 hours. And as you can see, it progresses. You have, after 1 month, you need to provide a final report. And the idea is to collaborate and collectively work on those warnings, those reportings, and make sure that you mitigate the threat as you progress in time. But we'll see how serious authorities will take non-accurate or the level of detail they will expect within those 24 or 72 hours.
Part of the issue here too. Oh, sorry, Bart, go ahead.
No, sorry.
Well, what I was going to say is we can look at a corollary here. When the 72-hour rule was introduced for GDPR, what we saw was an inundation of companies basically putting in their marker within 72 hours to say, oh, we might have had an issue, right? We're going to put in our marker here to make it under there. So if you've only got 4 hours, that may be where we end up. But even looking at the outside of this timeline of 1 month, any company who's had a significant cybersecurity incident knows that to get a final report done within a month of the discovery of the incident, or recovering from ransomware, whatever it is, that's incredibly hard. That is a ridiculously tight time frame. We're involved where the investigation could take 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, right, to find out what really happened there, to have a final report. And also the fact that you need to have a final report is different. So oftentimes after Capital One in the United States, a few other court cases, reports coming out of this were limited because there's class action risk, right? There's other, customer lawsuit risks that come out. So a report is oftentimes discoverable. And so thinking through the privilege issues here and what that's going to look like and how we do the reporting and how we're, to Bart's point, sort of partnering up with the authorities in Europe in terms of how to make these reports and get them finalized is something that's just, from a strategic perspective, really important for organizations to understand.
Well, you have to decide if you want to do business in Europe.
Yeah, I mean, it's something to consider if companies are going global, right? Is Europe the first place? But it's a huge market. Most companies, don't really have a choice here. And it's not to say that this stuff can't be done. It can be done. It just takes a really diligent effort. This is not something that is pure policies and procedures. This takes practice. This takes the right tooling in place. The right tabletops, really working through these issues ahead of time so that you're not scrambling in the midst of an incident.
Well, good news is it sounds like there's a plan somewhere that someone can start to get organized with, right?
Yeah.
Or probably already has because of some of the other regulatory remits. Well, let's keep going.
Sure. Moving from this to enforcement and penalties there, you're probably aware about the fines and threats or what have been reported under GDPR, which are quite daunting if you see them coming. DORA takes a different approach. It's not telling you right away, these are the penalties that need to be applied, and we provide you certain ceilings, but it lets member states decide on how to handle financial entities under their jurisdiction. So the German authorities, BaFin, is responsible to issuing penalties and fines to German financial institutions. The same goes for Ireland or Italy, you name it. So what we might see here, if you are a financial entity and you are setting up a new business in Europe, you might consider this and do forum shopping, deciding on where those fines might be lower. If we look at Luxembourg right now, where we see a lot of financial institutions going there, we have right now fines of up to 5 million euros or 10% of total annual turnover. And what we mentioned in the beginning, the responsibility of the boardroom, that's also going to be reflected in enforcement and sanctions. And member states need to provide for criminal penalties for boardroom members and ensure that management is fully liable to give DORA teeth and not make it a toothless tiger.
I think this is a key distinction from a lot of the other sort of general privacy, compliance, kind of general security things. This is personal criminal liability for management and board, right? That's a real game changer from a statutory standpoint. If you think about this globally, I mean, that's one where, we saw many years ago, a Google executive got picked up and put in jail in Italy, right, because of a YouTube video that hadn't been taken down in violation of an Italian court order. So this, you're looking at, in the midst of a data breach, if it's a determination that the board or management was negligent, you could have arrests made, right, in Europe on this. And that's a real significant change here, one that most boards aren't really aware of yet, but is the first question that's going to come out is, what's my liability here as a board member? What's my liability as management? And so it's something companies have to be prepared for them to ask questions about and understand, and they're going to need a lot of training on this to feel comfortable that the company has in place the right elements to address the requirements here.
Wow. So I'm going to push back a little bit because I find this incredibly interesting. Um, so we have corporations that are commercial organizations, corporations that are being attacked by nation states with infinite capabilities, infinite budgets, infinite number of attackers, and we have to defend against nation states. What is the government's responsibility to defend us against those nation states?
Oddly, they didn't bring it up in the law. This is one of the challenges that we face, right? I mean, and every company that's dealt with a data breach, and by that I can just say every company, um, understands that they're the victim, but to the public perception they aren't, to the government's perception they aren't, to the regulators they aren't. To the regulators, it's just you should have been better prepared, right?
Yeah.
And where we end up in these cases where we're in protracted disagreements with regulators as they're doing investigations is regulators unfortunately have a tendency to see the existence or the occurrence of a data breach or a cybersecurity incident as evidence that your security wasn't good enough, right? It's almost like you're starting off on the back foot. And so that's really where having a very well thought out program and everything else, so that when they come and say, have you done this is all the good things that Bart was talking about here, which are highly specific. And in Europe, you understand, must be documented, not just a process we have in place, but really the documentation there to show a binder that says, here's our DORA compliance, right? All of those things, that's critical to being able to push back against that narrative so that you can then say, this is what we were dealing with. Because you won't find very much sympathy amongst the regulators or the general public when it comes to responding to data breaches.
No, that totally makes sense. And I mean, for the audience out there, and I'm sure you're aware of it, but for every dollar that an adversary spends on capability to attack you, you have to spend $100 to defend. And so that's asymmetric, and it will always be asymmetric. And so, I think our things are challenging on a good day. On a bad day, they're going to be extremely challenging now. But there's things that can be done. That's the good news. And I think having a good offense against the regulator is a good defense. So making sure you have all this documentation and processes and everything put in place and ready to go. All right, Bart, let's keep going.
Yeah. Besides documentation, the fourth pillar we mentioned was the ICT third-party risk management, and there the contracting is key. Financial entities are required to execute certain contractual terms with you. They are clearly set out in DORA. There's Article 30, which you can basically take as a checklist and tick off, depending on whether you're tier 1 or tier 2, what obligations need to be in your contract and what you need to comply with. And this is what's required of you. If you're familiar with GDPR, it's similar to your data processing agreement, your DPA. You will have to add a DORA addendum to your terms. And looking at our normal ICT third-party service providers, so the tier 1 service providers, this is high level what you need to comply with. You'll see some of those obligations you say, I can tick the box. This is in our standard contract. This might also be covered in our DPA already, but be aware, DORA is not limited to personal data. The scope what GDPR covers, but also to non-personal data. So if you engage subcontractors, you need to make sure that the list you provide right now under GDPR needs to be extended to those service providers where you might have decided, they're just processing non-personal data. Now, on DORA, you need to provide the full list of your subcontractors. This is one key difference. And then you see that there are interesting obligations you need to comply with. the last box you see, training and awareness training. Yes, DORA asks you to take part in your financial entities training and awareness program. We're working on this with a lot of companies, clients, and found ways to mitigate these obligations, making sure that they are just not overburdening you and your obligation, limiting them to what's strictly required by DORA, as we see that financial institutions, to cover their back, are quite expensive when they reach out to you and have quite onerous obligations already for those tier one normal ICT third-party service providers. Moving this even to the next level, we have our tier two ICT third-party service providers, which are supporting critical or important function. And there you not only have to comply with what was on the slide before, but additional obligations. And here, one of the key burdens are for sure that you might be required to participate in threat-led penetration testing, and also the monitoring and audit requirements are quite onerous for companies, even if you have quite a solid security posture already. Mike, anything to add?
Yeah, one thing there is, especially when we get into this, I mean, two big picture comments. One, make sure your organization understands if you contract with financial institutions that are subject to DORA, you're going to be getting big, thick new addendums coming down the pike that are going to say, here's all the different requirements we're going to have on you, right? And understanding that that's going to add a little bit of a bump to the contracting process at this juncture, right? So it's going to take a little bit more time. Threat penetration testing, participation in monitoring audits, these are two of the most contentious things in terms of negotiation with customers on these points. In particular, when you're talking about participation in threat penetration testing or an audit of your security, there's privilege issues there, right? So if there's findings that come out of that, how do we protect those findings to make sure that they aren't in the open market, that nobody publishes them, right? A lot of things to really think through there that we've worked through with clients on this. So really understanding this stuff is coming. You're going to see these requirements come into place. How you react to them, what parameters you can set up to have in place the right concepts to be able to protect your systems, protect the information, the findings that come out of these audits and penetration testing issues is really, really critical. And you're not going to have a lot of time to negotiate it because the financial institutions are going to say this is kind of take it or leave it. They are obligated to put these things in place, and so they are going to push them down onto you all.
Wrapping up, DORA checklist. So what should you do? There's a checklist for financial entities. We need to look at DORA from one perspective, and it's documenting. A lot of this is documenting and making sure right now that you can tick the boxes, that you match what you might have under ISO, under NIST against DORA, and find those gaps and mitigate any gaps, and specifically addressing your obligations with ICT third-party service providers. Looking at it from their perspective, we see that what Mike just mentioned, if you're approached, assess first whether the assessment that you are supporting critical or important function is actually accurate. There are ways to push back, and we try to assist our clients not having to comply with those onerous monitoring audit obligations. But as well for you, it's required to perform a gap analysis and be prepared if you're confronted with those contractual obligations that you can, in the end, sign that addendum and be sure that you can comply. Update contract templates. Our suggestion for clients is to have their vendor-friendly DORA addendum ready, and if financial institutions reach out, tell them, see, this is how we approach it. We've documented it. It's all in place. And you can just go through your Article 30 checklist under DORA and see that our contractual obligation match what's required. And then, yes, in case you are actually subject to those more onerous obligations, be prepared that you might be audited, that financial entities will approach you, and that they expect you also that your incident reporting is up to date, up to speed, and reflects those rather rigid timelines you need to comply with.
I think that about wraps us up. I think that was our last slide on there. So I don't know if there are any other questions, or happy to answer them, as Carl noted earlier.
Yeah, we definitely have some more questions. So, with kind of the overlapping priorities of GDPR and DORA and other regulatory remits, how does an organization prioritize which one that, I mean, obviously they have to do all of them, but some organizations are going to have to pick and choose a couple of these things to focus on. So how do you prioritize this?
Well, as you said, Mike, go.
No, go ahead, Bart. I'd like your thoughts on it.
There's no way evading one or the other. If you're subject to GDPR and DORA, you just need to comply with both. For GDPR, because it's been around for quite some time, you should probably have most boxes ticked already. And now it's basically matching DORA against this, making sure that the additional obligations that are out there, you add them on top. Mike, but what are your thoughts?
No, that's what I was going to say. I mean, basically, don't think of them as separate silos or separate compliance obligations. Think of DORA as really additive, right? So leverage as much as you can of your existing policies and procedures. Maybe expand the scope on them. As Bart noted, DORA is data agnostic, but that's the trend we're seeing globally, right? If you look back at the SEC cybersecurity disclosure rules, those are data agnostic. I don't care if it's personal data or not. It really gets into the impact to the organization, and so taking a look more broadly and saying what existing policies and procedures are compliance with ISO 27001 or other elements that we have in place that we can leverage something that's existing and maybe tweak the scope a little bit. So we're not creating something out of whole cloth that's just European specific.
No, it makes sense. So we have time for one more question. And this question is, who gets the final say on what tier you're in?
The courts. I would say.
That was ominous, yeah.
So we're ending on a positive note then, I take it. So Ken, if someone designates you as a tier 3 and you think you're a tier 2, is there a mechanism for having that discussion and figuring this out, or is this going to be a uphill battle?
It's going to be an uphill battle for technology providers. It's the financial institution which get to make the call what tier you're in, tier 1 or tier 2. And they do an internal assessment, a subjective assessment of how critical your services are to their operation. And that's basically what you're confronted with. But I think if you prepare upfront, you can create white papers, you can create documentation which allows you to prove or convince financial institutions that you shouldn't be a tier 2 entity.
Yeah, I would just add to that quickly. The challenging bit there from a marketing standpoint is you'll oftentimes want to refer to your things as we offer critical service support and stuff like that. And then you go back to them and argue, actually, it's not critical. Right. And then, but tier 3, just Bart had mentioned it earlier, that's determined by the authorities. Right. So the pushback there is you don't really have much wiggle room.
Well, you know what? I am going to end this on a good note. And what that is two things. Number one, if you are identified as critical, double your price because you're critical. You should get more money for that critical service and help pay for some of this. And number two, huge thank you to Bart and Mike for joining us today. Really appreciate it. We had great questions in this webinar. We did not get to all the questions, but we absolutely promise that we will publish a FAQ on these so that you guys can have them. And then also we will be sharing this video with everyone who signed up for the webinar today. So you'll be able to review it and share it with your associates and friends if need be. So big thank you to both of you guys today for your time. This was excellent.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you everybody for joining and have a great rest of your day.